Welcome to Policy Brief, an informed and engaging conversation with policymakers, policy influencers, and public sector professionals. My name's Trevor Brown. I'm Dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. I'm proud to be your host today. And I'm joined by Christie Angel, who's the CEO and president of the YWCA of Columbus. Christie, how you doing today?
Pretty good, Trevor. Nice to be with you today.
It's great to be with you. Let's start with a simple question. I often ask a little bit of Civics 101. In this case, you're a nonprofit, so we're not talking about a public entity, but a lot of people, I think, synonymously equate the YWCA and the YMCA. So tell us about, just to start, what's the difference and why do we have one and now two?
Well, we both were founded in the 1800s. I believe YMCA is a little bit older than YWCA, and the names, our formal names of our organizations, Young Men's Christian Association, Young Women's Christian Association, while obviously it would appear that we are related. We call ourselves brother-sister organizations just because it's fun and we're partners on a number of things. But the organizations really were not connected in any way. Our founders, those are names that they picked based on kind of the founding of our organizations many, many years ago. In Columbus in particular, our organization was always an organization that the founding was about housing for women who were moving to the Columbus area from a more rural part of Ohio to find work, women who were supporting families by working in factories and such, especially during wartime, or women who were looking to pursue, some type of education or who had been widowed. We were founded in 1886. And through the years, our mission has always been about the empowerment of women and supporting women. But in the 1970s, Dr. Dorothy Height, who was, a social justice, civil rights activist, founded many organizations, including one for, at the time, was, the Council of Negro Women, and who marched with Dr. King and C.T. Vivian and Ralph Abernathy and many others and worked in some of those social justice organizations. She began to have the conversation about race and, as she called it, one imperative that you cannot empower women without also looking at, what we now call intersectionality, but then, the elimination of racism, and believe that our work was in both of those kind of parts of the work, so to speak. And so we adopted the one imperative, empowerment of women and elimination of racism. Our organization did in the 70s. And, we always had the promoting peace, justice, freedom, dignity for all. And so there are, uniquenesses to the two organizations, but our organization intentionally has been, involved in social justice work around empowerment of women and race, ending racism.
Great, thanks. I always benefit from those history lessons, so I didn't realize that they were distinctly separate and the names weren't so connected or analogous. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. So now fast forward, it's 2020. You mentioned housing and women, and then added race in there as an addition. What here in Central Ohio are the foci for you and the organization? What are you trying to achieve? At the beginning of 2020.
Beginning of 2020. So again, I go back to, we have the somewhat unique, goal where we have a social justice, set of priorities, if you will, and we also are a service organization. And so in January of 2020, we were setting about approving a new advocacy agenda that included housing justice and pay equity. And we were also about, continuing to advocate for, families that are homeless, increased funding for homelessness, in particular homeless families. We had some success coming out of the 2019 budget cycle from our local government participants or partners. And we were also starting to think about, the expansion of our social enterprise. Our social enterprise is after school care in the Westerville and Gahanna communities, and we were starting to look at some possible expansion. Really in January 2020, that's what we thought our work would look like this year.
So I'm glad you mentioned the funds you have to raise in the social enterprise. Our audience is nerdy. They want to know how things work. So you've talked about the goals of the enterprise. Now, how do you fund that enterprise? What's the revenue sources for the YWCA? And indulge us a little bit and tell us what is a social enterprise and how does that work for you all?
So we, I always say our budget is about a third, but that's for easy math. Math not being my favorite subject. So, a third of our revenue just about comes from grants and federal or government funds. So, if you think about funds from the city, the county, HUD, those largely help to support our housing work. And, grants that we apply for, be it TANF monies from the state of Ohio or other, grant opportunities that help us fund, in particular, the housing work. We run permanent supportive housing, that's housing for people with disabilities and wraparound supports. And we have shelter for families who find themselves homeless. And so those two parts of the enterprise do receive significant government support. The next third of our revenue, I would say, is fundraising. We raise a large portion of funds every year. We have, a healthy fundraising budget. We don't always meet goal, but most of the time we get right up to the goal or we exceed the goal. That is where we have some corporate contributions and corporate grants, and then fundraising from events and individuals. So we have a fundraising plan. Every year we're looking at that plan. We put it into 4 quarters, and we are trying to raise almost, of the $2.5 million we need to raise every year. We kind of say, okay, divided by 4 quarters, how much do we need to bring in every quarter from all of those different sources? And then the last part of the revenue is the social enterprise. So for a nonprofit like ours, we have a business, and our business is the business of after school care. And in Westerville and Gahanna, we run those programs inside of each elementary school, and families who need aftercare. And in Westerville, there are families who actually need before school care as well, because school gets started a little later. And people have to go to work, so they need a place for their safe place for their kiddo to go, while they're waiting for school to start. And we offer enrichment, healthy play, snacks, breakfast in the morning if a light breakfast if we're in Westerville. We have some social emotional learning and the like. And so those programs have been operating for almost just about 30 years in both of those communities. And those are private pay programs for the most part. Families commit to, paying a weekly payment to YWCA Columbus for that care. The revenue that comes, from that, which is about $3 million a year, that revenue helps support the agency. So obviously it costs a lot of money to run that program. You have probably, I'd say about 80 employees, about 20 or so part-time, and then another 60 or so, or 20 full-time, and about 60 part-time. And so, the funding of the people to make the enterprise go, but then the second part of it, is revenue that then comes into the organization that helps support the other work that we're doing. And so, for going back to housing, housing being supported by government funds and some, grants in particular, that funding for many years was flat. And up until the end of last year, we hadn't received really an increase in the funding, but the cost of doing that, running that business continues to increase because, housing is costly, especially in our community right now. And the number of homeless families has continued to increase, along with the cost of food and all the other things, right? Heat, electricity, etc. You're providing all of that, in the system, and so the enterprise helps offset those costs as well. And the enterprise, or the social enterprise, was also helping to fund some of our social justice work, along with some donors, but largely our social justice work was being supported by the business side of YWCA Columbus.
So this is a fascinating innovation, really, in the way nonprofits are run, is the advent of social enterprise. And so that leaves you with a very balanced portfolio. You're a third, a third, a third, and that gives you some hedge on risk, that one goes down, another goes up. When did you all add the social enterprise component to your mix of programs and then revenue sources?
Well, it was just about, I would say, probably about 35 years ago. We, started in the child care business and began, some combination of private pay and, government supported child care. And through those years, it has, I would say, ebbed and flowed. Sometimes we've had just birth to pre-K. Other times we've had, the programs, the before or after school care programs. We've had programs in Columbus City Schools, New Albany, Gahanna, and Westerville. The Gahanna and Westerville programs have been, those that have been sustained through the years. New Albany, probably 10 years ago or more, decided to bring their after-school care program in-house. And in Columbus City Schools, I'd say probably 12 years ago or so, those programs, weren't working as well as we all would have liked. And so we ended that partnership. Although we continue to always look for, opportunities to provide that service. The Westerville Gahanna models are well-oiled machines. And as we like to say, we know how to do that very, very well. And in the summer, I would add, we also have summer camp in those communities. So we also offer summer camp, which is all day, an all-day program with, fun activities as you might have in camp, but also some educational enrichment as well.
Great. So a great model of, as you say, social enterprise, where you're pursuing social ends, but generating resources that allow you to deliver other kinds of services to your clients. Okay, great. That's fantastic background. I'm much better informed on the YWCA. So let's talk about two events or series of events that really rocked our community here in Central Ohio and across the country. So the first was COVID, and then the second was George Floyd's death and the awakening. Broadly, I mean, many were well aware of the challenges that people of color face in dealing with public institutions like the police, but that really raised the consciousness of America about some of these issues. Talk about how, and you pick, which of those really impacted the YWCA and its programs. I want to dive into sort of where you went after the start of the year to now many months into it. How did those two events impact how you deliver services?
Sure. Well, let me start with COVID-19. For us, we started having the conversation as an organization in our board just about right around March 5th or so. I believe it was the first Wednesday in March. It followed the City of Columbus's decision to suspend the Arnold or change the Arnold Classic. Now, you think, well, what did that have to do with YWCA Columbus? Well, two things. One, we are incredibly grateful and incredibly blessed to have Dr. Mashika Roberts, the City of Columbus Public Health Commissioner, on our board. And so we were able to have a board discussion about the decision that the city and the state made to change the Arnold and what that might mean for our community overall and how that was going to impact YWCA Columbus. So immediately we started, we looked at our housing protocols and changed, cleaning procedures and some basic things just around health and safety in the buildings where people live. 7 days later, just about, the governor announced that he was closing school for a period of time, that schools were going to, be shutting down. And when those schools shut down, as you might imagine, we just spoke about the social enterprise, that program also closed. And so the revenue generated from that program, it was essentially frozen. At that time we were trying to decide, and we were talking to parents about, should we be, refunding money? What does this mean? And of course, on March 12th, we were all saying, let's wait and see. We thought this was maybe 2 weeks or maybe a month. We did not know how long. But what that means for families in shelter is that now their children, because children go to school, their families, maybe they're homeless, but they go to school and they're homeschooled. So that also meant that children were in the shelter all day long. Families, were scrambling, trying to figure out what they were going to do with their kiddos, because people were still working at that time. And then, of course, systematically, we saw things shut down, right? We saw, we went to a stay-at-home order. What does that mean, et cetera? So for us, on the homeless system side, all costs increased. So cleanings, food, heating, everything you can imagine, because where we would not have people in the building 24 hours a day, we now have everyone, families, et cetera, 24 hours a day. We also have a team of people we needed to add to our staff so that we could assist in caring for kiddos and doing some other things just to, and you just had more people in the building. So we deployed some of our after school care education team over to our family center, those who were able to work, and we had them, providing, some source of fun and educational enrichment to assist families as they were, some still trying to go to work and still trying to look for housing. When it became apparent to us that families couldn't even do those things, then we, really just set up, kind of an operation that allowed people to stay back in their living quarters. Usually we have people come out and we clean and so forth. We changed our cleaning schedules, et cetera. And then the purchase of PPE began. Yeah. And so masks and gloves and sanitizer and all of the things that we needed to buy, we quickly started buying all of that. And so our increased, cost of operating just, went up exponentially. Of course, then we lost the social enterprise. And so that revenue, we started forecasting, for at least the second quarter of the year, we were not going to have that revenue available to us. And, we changed our fundraising strategy and our plan, and we began to talk to the community about, we're still providing service in the time of a pandemic. And we saw just, a huge increase and outpouring of love and support to especially the family center for meals, food, needed items, cleaning supplies, money. We were able to apply for emergency loans, PPP, and all of those things. And so as that became kind of our new norm and somewhat stable, I will say, great team, the team that, no COVID infections at this time among families at the family center, and just really, using all of the right protocols and keeping everyone as, safe and healthy and socially distant as we can, and how they figured out how to do all of that. Then George Floyd is murdered. And the social justice movement, kind of, I always say began, but I will say was renewed in a different way. And then the social justice side of our organization kicks in, and I found myself as a leader in the organization, at many tables talking about police reform, talking about, what is needed in our community, even asking for calm during those days where we saw not the protesters, but others come in and kind of take advantage of a situation. At least, that was a viewpoint that many of us had. But also just talking to leaders about, where we need to go from here. What we then saw as a trusted organization in this community that does understand how to talk about race, we saw an influx of resources, organizations who wanted to make an investment in social justice work, including our work around the elimination of racism. Well, Trevor, we had a plan that we were starting to work on that was going to kind of expand that team, and we hadn't quite found all of the pieces and parts to fund it, but we were starting, to take a look at that, and it was about a 2-year plan, I'd say. That 2-year plan became about a 2-month plan because we found ourselves with the resources and the investment to support that work. So we received significant investment in the work. We are standing up a racial equity training program. We are in the position now where we can hire a new policy analyst to help us with our advocacy work and research and writings. We also found ourselves, we were talking about racism as a public health crisis with other YWCAs in the state last September. And we had started talking to the city and the county about racism as a public health crisis. They both passed declarations or resolutions to declare that. We stood with them, we testified. We're now part of implementation teams to help kind of implement the changes that are needed, that really look at some of the social determinants of health. And so, out of tragedy, and out of, something that continues to happen, and we all continue to talk about, what can we do to make, bring about change, in particular, in that system. But obviously, our goal is, let's start talking about building an anti-racist community and individuals in the like. We were able to receive investment and to really jumpstart a part of our organization and work that we had hoped, in 2 years to expand, and now we're expanding.
So you had a phrase I want to come back to earlier where you said that the YWCA is a trusted organization that knows how to talk about race. Do me a favor, elaborate on that a little bit. What did you mean by that, and what are some ways that your organization is particularly well positioned to help the community have a conversation around race?
Mm-hmm. Well, I go back to the trusted organization because we've been here, for so long, and we've been talking about race in various ways since the 70s, and that has evolved, and our work has evolved. But when we say talk about race, one, it is giving, individuals and organizations the space to learn about our history, to understand kind of this construct called race, to talk about, what it means, now we use the words anti-racist, we use the words allyship, how to build allies, and really to take someone along on a journey. And certainly, for us, it's everything from land acknowledgements, regarding in our community, the indigenous peoples who were here long before us, goes all the way, through, what we see happening around immigration in this community, and beyond, obviously, to talk about the history of slavery and construct of race is a part of it. So it's a historic, we understand the history that we kind of sit in and stand in, so to speak. And then now let's talk about kind of, where we are today and where we want to go, and things that are still impediments and still create barriers for people, in particular, women and people of color, those who find themselves marginalized. And so we've learned various ways and techniques to do that. And, many people would come to us and say, I remember you used to do the, racism dialogues or the study circles. And so we don't do that anymore. Now we do, our work is done in a different way. We have, libraries of books that we use to teach and to do some of the work. We have videos, we have podcasts. I mean, there's so many tools available to us. And so that trust that people have in us, because I think just some longevity, but also because it is embedded in our mission, and we have, access to resources to help us maybe tailor, some conversations. has been, has created opportunities for us. We didn't just get into this work.
So I know this is going down perhaps a tributary here rather than the main river, but I'm fascinated. So much of what we're being encouraged as citizens of the United States, and perhaps other parts of the world too, is to engage in individual conversations around race and injustice, just like you and I are doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm intrigued by this idea of how do we get a community to have this important conversation? And how do we know when that conversation is really meaningful and impactful? I think we all are starting to wrestle with, well, how would I know? I've read something or I've had a conversation with somebody and I feel changed in some way. How from your perspective, running this organization that's been here for over a century and played such a central part in the community, how will you know when we as a community are in a different place around race? How will these conversations that you all are so adept at facilitating lead to the community having a different perspective and a different understanding of race and injustice and inequity?
Well, I don't have all of the answers for that. I think we're wrestling with that ourselves and what our measurement and evaluation tools are and will be and are going to be. But I will say, some of the things that my team and I, our team, what we start talking about is change behavior, change in policy,
Mm-hmm.
And not change in policy that, yes, there's always there's a push from, the external, or advocates like us, but when there is a coalition of the willing inside of leadership, in government in particular, where policies are changed, a willingness to have, to build equity into decision making. So whether it's land use policy or affordable housing policy, the racism as a public health crisis, equity, right? Really starting to look at what equity means in a community. And when the other measurement that we always go back to, and we haven't quite, figured out what our scorecard is going to look like, so to speak, although there are many of us talking about this in the community, is when there's not just one person of color or one LGBTQ person, right? One representative from every, but when it is a very diverse table, and there one is a token, and two or more is when we really start to have influence, I guess, and when we see that, not just in nonprofit work or government work, but when we also see it in the for-profit sector, when we see more leaders, and decision-making roles that impact, an organization or an enterprise that are of color, different gender, LGBTQ, and so on. And so, as I said, we're still wrestling with the actual evaluation tools that we will begin to use, and there are many of us talking about this. We're talking about this with the Columbus Urban League. They look at a lot of economic indicators as well, and I think that there is going to be, there will also be that. There will be some economic indicators that we will have to measure as well, so that we see, some improvement in our community along the lines of wealth building and wealth generation, home ownership, those kinds of things as well. But we don't want to measure just those things, right? We want to.
So as we close up here, let's look to the future. We're 2-3 years out from now. What do you see as a changed Columbus and a changed YWCA? Or do you think in a couple of years it'll be just like it was in January 2020?
I certainly hope not. I think, if we were, let's say 3 years out, 3 years out for us, for our organization in particular, would mean that, our racial equity program will have provided guidance and or, foundational training, maybe even, more than that, you know, to many, many organizations. And I tend not to be the person who says it has to be, you know, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, but I do, you know, think that we are going to start to look at, you know, how many, who in the sectors do we start to have, where do we start to have an impact, you know, in whether it's education sector, nonprofit, for-profit, small business, large business, and the like. And so we'll be building that out this year, and you know, we would want to have a profound impact and have really started this conversation to create change. And we're going to launch something, just so that you know, in, I believe it will be February or March of next year, and it's a 21-day racial equity challenge. Mm-hmm. We're going to launch that with 14 other YWCAs in Ohio, perhaps many other YWCAs across the country. We're working, my colleague in Cleveland is working on a launch plan beyond just Ohio, but it takes 21 days to change a habit. And so our goal is that in 3 years, we will, that will become part of our work. That'll be part of our muscle, so to speak, and that we will start this racial equity journey in many, many places and spaces, you know, not only in this community, but across the state through YWCA organizations. Will be carefully curated content, video, reading. You can go, you know, kind of top lines or go as deep as you want in the work. And it's already been tested. And so we're really excited about that. So I hope, you know, that program will become one that becomes a game changer inside of many organizations and homes. And then I would also say for our community, in 3 years, what I would like to see is new land use policy that does away with the 1950s Euclidean zoning that is really tired, and it's time to move beyond that, because I think when we have zoning policy, land use policy in particular, that is built and has some foundation of equity built into it, that we can begin to see neighborhoods change and transform, and neighborhoods that have, you know, been disinvested in for years receive investment, but also we see people begin to live where they want to live, because I think when we live near one another, there are also relationships and, you know, commonalities and, you know, that occur. And that's going to take a lot. It's not just going to be the city of Columbus. We're going to need our suburban communities to come alongside us. And I think this is a wave that is happening. And I hope in 3 years we have that new land use policy. I would also say that I hope in 3 years that we no longer need a robust homeless system, in particular homeless family system, because we have been working for many, many years to improve that system. And what is definitely needed, you know, we've got connection to work, connection to resources, I mean, all of these things, but the pieces that we do not have is housing that people can afford. And along with housing that people can afford is a wage that people can live off of. And we've got to wrestle with that as a community, because the money that we're spending we spend about, it's a fun fact, or not so fun fact, to keep someone housed is about $2,200 roughly. That's the cost. If someone called today and said, I need assistance to stay in my home, I need some rent assistance or a car repair that will allow me to pay my rent, on average, it's about $2,250. When someone becomes homeless, the cost to rehouse someone who is homeless, in particular a family, is about $7,700. And so the cost to our community to rehouse people, if we can just figure out how to get people housed, housing is a great stabilizer. From all things, you know, people can grow from that. And you look around, Trevor, and there are lots of vacant housing, there are lots of vacant apartments, you know, but beyond that, I mean, you know, there's opportunity to build. We've got to build where transit or transportation is so people can get to work. All of those things we need to, as a community, decide if we're going to be that community where we want people to be housing secure. And I hope that this organization in 3 years has had a profound impact on that work. Housing justice is one of the most important things that we will do in the next 3 years, along with our racial equity work.
Well, it's laudable work, and we are so appreciative as citizens here of Central Ohio. So, Christie, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day and all that good work you're doing to chat with me. And we really want to be there to support you. So, for all of those out there who want to help, go to the website of the Columbus YWCA, and there are lots of ways that you can engage and help Christie and her counterparts in doing good work. So, thanks, Christie. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been great to be with you, and hello to all of those students and alums out there.